Those of you who've heard me before know that I say that Lake Forest is the most preservation-conscious community in the state of Illinois. And that's attributable because we live in a great place and natural surroundings with history, and everyone can be a preservationist. I don't know about you, but I've felt kind of underprivileged this week when I walked around Market Square, as I felt I was the only one there and the whole community had flown someplace. But I'm glad that you all could come this afternoon. The Preservation Foundation has placed great emphasis on working towards bringing West Park into recognition as a treasure. And it's our desire and hope that with the support of people who live in West Park, we can make it a National Historical District. The other emphasis that has fallen upon the preservation arose out of at least one event that highlighted to us the significance and importance of Market Square. When Marshall Field sold to Macy's, there were a number of articles in the local paper as well as the Chicago Tribune, where people said that they were not going to patronize Macy's because of Marshall Field's love that they had experienced during the century. I mean, I can't tell you how long Marshall Field has been there, but a long, long time. And the name is a landmark. And people have felt like they've lost a friend. But when the Preservation Foundation looked at the significance and importance of Market Square to Lake Forest, when you stop and think of all of the things that you love in Lake Forest, it can be the parks, it can be the lake, it can be the ravines, it can be the trees, it can be all of these things that are important. But if you stop and think about it for a moment, Market Square is the center of Lake Forest, the emblem of our community. But we thought it would be appropriate to visit with the official officer of Macy's. So we made a great effort to contact people in the Macy's managerial positions to see if they wouldn't have us welcome us at an open house in their store for our Christmas party. And those of you who were there know what a great event it was. Macy's catered this from the beginning to the end, including music, champagne, caviar. It was an outstanding party that they hosted. But the reason they did that, and the reason we did it, was to say to those who have fallen in love with Marshall Field that that's well and good. But if you stop to think about the Macy's store that is there today, it's the anchor store of Market Square. And if we don't support Macy's, located in Market Square store, and all of the other merchants who surround Macy's, if we choose to go off shopping someplace else for whatever reason it is, and we don't patronize the merchants that are in Market Square, you can imagine that the preservation of Market Square as we know it and love it could be endangered on the long term. And that experience happened, perhaps Art Miller will share that with you, but when Market Square was first formed, there were some economic difficulties that were in its history. Now, when you stop and look at other communities that surround us, take Deerfield or Highland Park, and if you think that Market Square will survive because of its beauty and our love, perhaps that's not true. And so we felt that it would be very, very appropriate to have this, our meeting on Market Square, and in the next few days after this program, we are going to have a newsletter that is going to feature Market Square and historical information that I'm sure you'll hear this afternoon, as Art Miller has generously taken time to write all of the material that is found in our newsletter. Now, what could be more appropriate than to have two speakers who love Lake Forest? Shirley Paddock was born here. And not only does that give her credentials, she has discovered the cabin that was the oldest structure that was hidden. She found the archives on all of the history of the development of Market Square under Lackey's building. And Art Miller tells me he's been here a quarter of a century, the librarian at Lake Forest College. And I'm sure all of you know that they are celebrating their 150th anniversary year this year. Without further ado, I'll call on Art and Shirley.
Thank you. And thank you all for coming. It's true, my passion is Lake Forest, and I've been researching it for many, many years. And it's kind of exciting because you keep learning new things about it because of the new technology. And first I used to sit and read all the Lake Foresters page by page and everything and make notes and everything. And then I realized one day that the person who did a lot of real estate in Lake Forest was John Griffith. He started here like in 1904, and the business is still there. And I thought about it, and then I realized that John Griffith never moved. When he did the square, there's still one of the few, they're in the very same location that started when the square started. So I took it upon myself to call Gordon Lackey and asked him if they ever kept any records. And he said, yes, they did. And I said, well, are they available? And he said, well, you know, they're all in the basement. Okay, I said, well, could I go in the basement? He said, why, Shirley, would you want to go in the basement? Well, I said, I've read everything I can read, and I realized that John Griffith was the first realtor. He did work with Market Square and took care of that whole development, and I just thought maybe you might have something. So I called my friend Art and said, I think we have a little treasure hunt. They're going to let us go to see the records of Griffith, Grant, and Lackey at that time. So we got together and went there, and Gordon led us to the back of the office, and not knowing, he stopped us, and then he picked up a trap door on the floor and said, well, there you are. And we looked at each other, okay. So we went down, and he leans down, he said, when do you want me to come back? Oh, he said, don't worry about it, I'll check on you. And he shut the lid. Well, that didn't bother Art and I, because when we realized what was there, our excitement overwhelmed us. And one of the true findings there, one of them was a box, an old wooden file box, and in it was the history of Market Square, Howard Van Dorenshaw's box. And it's a real treasure trove. It's been all documented and preserved and everything, and it's the true history of the square. And things that you don't find in the newspapers, and people forget, well, they didn't tell people because at that time you don't tell everything. So now it's kind of, you know, archival. Turn my notes here. Also, that with his Howard Van Doren Shaw, one has to realize, and we didn't maybe know that he had done West Park subdivision, and they had, and Art will elaborate on this, and they had gone into doing the same concept of the square, everybody putting in so much money to develop it. And I put a letter on the back, it's 1912 dated, telling you who the investors were, and it also tells you what they were going to pay the Western Avenue Front Street, how much money. It's very unique. It's a very lovely piece. One other thing we found down there, to me, I like the little things. And what I think is interesting is, if you always notice Lake Forest had green, everybody uses green. I call it Lake Forest green. Well, in the archives there, they have letters about painting the square green with the Pratt number that they used. And I always heard the terminology of Lake Forest green. And that's just a little tidbit. It's kind of interesting because we've always kind of kept that color alive. Let's see here. I think the other thing is that we didn't realize is the people who moved the buildings of Market Square, the local businesses and the houses. Most of the square was built by local contractors. And I don't think, we've given them enough credit because they really weren't written up in the papers, but they were all there. There was Niemeyer, there was Griffiths Brothers, there was Henrik, there was Pester, who was here only a short time. And through these archives now, we can write about these things. And we might learn from their families more history about our square, because not everything is always written. You can find little stories of things, artifacts people would have found. And like, for instance, through the papers there, when they dug the square, we found that, what did they do with all this dirt? And I know that sounds kind of funny. Well, nobody really cared, but it's interesting. They took it to West Park. And West Park, if you know where the ice skating rink part, where we flooded every year, they put it there because that was like a lake. I only got one map that shows that as a lake, like a pond. I don't mean a big lake, but a body of water. And so they fill that in, and that's why when we have the skating pond, water retains, I suppose, naturally very well there. That's my little tidbits, and now I'm going to turn this over to Art.
Well, one thing about Market Square is it's been celebrated at different times, but I think this is as Jim points out, it's a great time to celebrate Market Square. And its significance locally, nationally, and really internationally for the kinds of things that it represents. It was first for some things, and that's some of this information was known when the really groundbreaking book about this was done in 1984 by Susan Dart, who now lives in North Carolina. Susan published a book that took the plans as they existed, reproduced blueprints of that, showed pictures, showed who the original tenants were in the square, talked about Howard Van Doren Shaw, the architect, and generally was the first one to really talk about the square's history. Since then, well, that's usually when you publish something, it leads to more things being turned out and found out. And so then a couple of years later, in 1988, Michael Ebner of the Lake Forest College history faculty cited in his history about when he talked about Lake Forest and creating Chicago's North Shore, he noted that the Highland Park paper had made a reference to a town market plan that was reported as being done in 1912. Well, nobody knew where that plan was. It turned out that it was down there in that dark basement. What Gordon told us was that they went down in the basement twice a year. They went down in December. The secretaries drew straws, and the short straw had to go down and get the Christmas ornaments. And then, after the holidays, when they took them down, they did it again, and another secretary maybe would have to take them back down there because it was kind of spooky. The trapdoor filled the entire hallway in the office, so that if you had the trapdoor down, nobody could get through. I mean, kind of stopped business. So that's why things were pretty much undisturbed. John Griffith was one of the key players in this. He was a local developer. There were other major players, and it fits in with the whole history of the community, as the slides will kind of show us, and I think I'll start that. But I wanted to mention these first. A recent history in 1997 by an architectural historian, Richard Longstreth, who's been since then a president of the Society of Architectural Historians, pointed out that it was the first city beautiful town center to be designed around motor vehicles. And it was a model for malls in a little bit later in Florida and California following World War I. And then for subsequent developments after that. It was published in magazines after Market Square was done, and it had a big impression. And it really was, we said it's the first shopping center, but it was really more than that. It was the first time a town center was planned around motor vehicles, cars and trucks. Originally there was an alley for trucks to go down, but of course we know that the trucks today could never, they can't even hardly get into Market Square at all. And so, but the original scale of trucks could go through there too. So it was for cars and trucks. It was the first City Beautiful Town Center, Longstreth also points out, the first City Beautiful Town Center to be commercially self-sustaining and paying for itself versus being dependent on tax revenue, subsidized by having a city hall or a library as the main anchor business or main anchor building. This was the first time this has been done. The Chicago Plan, 1909, envisioned big public buildings being built, and that would be the organizing principle of it. And those of you who saw the meeting here in January heard Frank Farwell say that this was the first real estate investment trust. Market Square was followed a model that had been followed since the beginning of Lake Forest of really having passing the hat and getting everybody to contribute. It was voluntary contributions, but this was before the income tax. There were no deductions for contributions, no deductions for real estate depreciation or things like that. So it was voluntary, but to a certain point. People were told how much they were supposed to volunteer. And if they didn't volunteer it right off the bat, they came back to them and asked them again to volunteer, and they sort of stayed with it until they came across. So it was mostly it was the people of the Owensia Club community who had built their club west of the old part of the town, and they were pretty much assessed according to how wealthy they were considered to be as to how much they should contribute. They ponied up 3 or 4 different times before the project was done, and the letter in the back deals with the first stage of buying the land, which was the most crucial part. And that was done, and that's what you'll see who contributed for that. Some of those same people that are listed back there also were part of the West Park people who 5 years earlier had paid to have Lake West Park created and subsidized the lots there, and those were all due in 5 years. So there's sort of a relationship between the two projects. Without too much further ado, I think I'll go to turning on the slides and seeing if we can do this with some visual aids. This is the 1857 plan of Lake Forest, and what's exciting about this plan is it was, besides that it was curvilinear streets, the first time on that scale, it had a town center, which was an educational institution. It had no businesses. It was decided that businesses would be west of the tracks, outside of the town in effect. All the roads kind of converged on the depot uptown, and it was almost a gated community. So in a way, it's the first gated community. But the businesses were outside the town, and they were like places that you just didn't see. They were kind of behind the scenes, backstage. This is a little bit more close-up, from 1861, what it looked like. Buildings starting to be there. There were actually a couple of stores that wobbled onto McKinley Avenue, and there was a store there that actually they used to house some of the first city meetings. But D.R. Holt, who built a big house on Sheridan Road, who was known for his strong opinions, said that he refused to build his house if they had any businesses on this side of the tracks, or I mean on the east side of the tracks. So they moved the buildings across, and by the stores and everything then regrouped on the other side, on the Western Avenue side, very soon in the early 1860s. This just shows the way the open space was in that old central part of town with the railroad track going up and down there. You can see that those were the educational parks and then Forest Park along the lake. The town was seen centered on that open space where Lake Forest College is now. It was then Lind University, later Lake Forest University. And the town, the townspeople mostly would be developing along Western Avenue. This is the kind of businesses that sprang up. Some of them were bricks, some of them were wood along Western Avenue. Not pictured is there was a livery stable and a catering operation that was on right across from the depot or the train station. By 1900 it would be. And we maybe all can imagine what the sort of general essence of horse that would have permeated the neighborhood would have been if you had a stable right there. And little big black flies that might have run around, you know, and nipped at your heels while you're waiting for the train. So it was a colorful area. This was fine as long as everybody was going east, but when they started going west to the Green Bay Road area and to the Enwencia Club, which the Lake Forest Golf Club started out being where the day school is in 1894. 1896, they moved to their current location a little bit south on Green Bay Road. And so people had to schlep past all this stuff to get to where they wanted to go, that was beautiful countryside. So they began to chafe under that. And very soon, 1895, they built the building that you see there with the copper-covered dome. 1895, the Blackler Building. I think it's likely that this was built by the architects Pond and Pond in Chicago. Then in 1903, way on the extreme right, the Anderson Block was built, constructed in 1903 on the corner of on the northwest corner of Deer Path and Western Avenue. Further north on Western Avenue, you began to have some development. You can see there's a gray frame building that a lot of us remember until just about 10 years ago when it was torn down for Lake Forest Bank property. But those two buildings were built in the years after the Anderson Block was built. One is the Griffith Building, and the other is the Gordon Building, I think, on the left. And then it begins to be the edge of Market Square there. But there were some intermediate buildings there. So this was some of the context in which Market Square would be built, with these buildings on the north and the Anderson Block on the south. This is another view showing what those buildings looked like later. And this is what they looked like earlier. This was one of the buildings that was there. Now this is, on the right is John Griffith. He had widespread railroad interest, and one of the best pictures we have of him is traveling out west, and he had a little train wreck, and here he's pictured in front of the train wreck. But he was very instrumental and very good, really knew the local situation very well, and was very instrumental in making Lake Forest work, making Market Square work commercially. That was him with the kind of broad-brimmed hat there on the right. The train station was on the east, across the, on both sides of the tracks, and that was the context there with the Tudor architecture that was built in 1900, the largest suburban train station to that time, built by Frost and Granger. Now, it was built for the Enwencia Club, which started having its horse shows that year in late June. They went from 1900 to 1970, brought out huge crowds of people from the city. I think it was just coincidental that Frost and Granger, who were sons-in-law of the owner of the railroad, Marvin Hewitt, they all happened to live here in town. But be that as it may, they still built the station. That's a joke. This is the back of those stores that we saw, and there's a certain casualness to the way this developed back there. It definitely this was not the kind of image of Lake Forest that they wanted to project to the new people coming all to town and all the people visiting polo players now. Now this shows from above, and I picked this because I didn't have right handy a picture to grab of the City Hall. But City Hall was built in 1899 up on the upper left there with a tower. So we had a tower on the Blackler building. We had a tower over there on City Hall. And this was all part of the context of what was doing. There was also a city building where Southgate Restaurant is now, which I think changed shape over the years, but that was city property. So the square was woven in among all these different factors, already existing context. This shows the plan of the square then in that space. On the left of the picture would be the Walgreens building. On the right would be Einstein's, pretty much. On the north would be the big parking lots that we now know, and then beyond that the Baptist Church. And on the north, to the left, on the upper left would be where City Hall was. You can see this plan. Now what's very important to understand is that this is the third plan done over a series of years. What's very important is to see that the first two plans involved a very shallow little development plan for a park. The park was very shallow at the beginning. I'm just going to walk over and point to where the park ended before. So the park only went that far, and then behind it was in the first plan in 1912 called Town Market. There were on both sides there were two short, identical towers, very much like the South Tower is today, but quite a bit shorter. And the central building was right there up close to the railroad station, and more finely detailed, very much in the manner of one of Palladio's villas in Vicenza from the 16th century. Using that as a reference, I think. Another plan was done in 1914, very much the same, but with at the north end of this a library. You see, trying to inject something that would be tax supported, that would help pay the bills and make the thing go. Because they were trying to figure out, and Griffith, I'm sure, was working with them to come up with the right package of rents that would actually pay to have this thing happen. And it's Richard Longstreth, the architectural historian, who explains how revolutionary and how clever it was that they came up with the plan in 1915 to push that park way back to the west, to the top of the picture here, to move that villa-type building that was going to be the central building way back. And so that changed the looks of that building quite a bit. It got much more hefty pillars that we have there now. The columns that we have are much heftier than they were originally envisioned to be. There were going to be two levels with porches and things and much more finely detailed, but that would have all been lost if you were standing on the railroad platform. You wouldn't have seen it. And the buildings used all the elements of the 1912 plan, but pushed them back, and so you got these two long buildings that are informal on either sides of the central building, the north and south buildings. Those came about in this new radical plan. What it did and why it was commercially functional is that it created 300 times as much front footage that you could get top rent for from merchants. And that's why it was able to pay for itself. And you can see Griffith's calculations in these files. I'm sure that the big downtown developer, Arthur Aldous, was enthusiastic about all the plans, but it was Griffith who had to really actually rent the stuff, and he finally felt that this one would work. And that's what's radical about this. This is the first time that something like this was commercially viable, and why it was so interesting to people after World War I, because this was done months before the beginning of World War I. After World War I, when they started developing these things in California around cars and in Florida, this was which really captured their attention about the City Beautiful movement, which was a reform idea about central cities, just like in Lake Forest with the shacks coming down and something nice going up. The architecture is very much in the range of town planning architecture from the 1880s to the 1910s in England. We've surely found a newspaper article that points out that was in the collection, that points out that the model for it was Port Sunlight, a model industrial town outside of Liverpool, I believe. And Shirley's taken several pictures of that, and there are lots of similarities in not necessarily in scale, but in the character of the plan. So it's quite interesting about that. Okay, so here's what it looked like when it was completed. Much taller towers than originally envisioned, again because of the changes in scale of the park space. Very macho columns, Tuscan columns or Doric columns down at the end, and colonnade, arcade up at the front. There was originally supposed to be an arcade surrounding the park, and it only survived on the north and south. Along the streets, you had also this kind of English town planning, idealistic 18th century almost shop characters or Regency shop characters. You can see there where the French's, it's now La Mirage shop, but it was the French no, not French's drugstore, Kraft's drugstore. Kraft's drugstore, when I first came to town in the 70s, and he had actually been the only one who'd built his own building. The Lake Forest Improvement Trust, the people that put this together, were not against other people putting their money in to do this, but he was the only one that came forward initially. They'd hoped to unload the rest of it, but the vicissitudes of mid-20th century finances meant that they held on to it until the 1980s. But that was the one building that was actually built by its owner, but in the plan with the architecture. This would show that at the west end was the Young Men's Club, which was originally planned to be built next to West Park on the corner of Summit Place and Summit Avenue. It got built in 1916 on Forest Avenue, I believe that is, right north of, directly north of the main formal west of the main formal building. Today it's north of Southgate. You can see it's white stucco, covered with white stucco. This is a 1917 fire plan, map that Shirley located that shows the building, and I think the pink connotes that it's brick construction, yellow would connote frame. Is that right, Shirley? Yeah. And you can see how Market Square fit into all these other features that were already there, and certainly increased the amount of brick construction in town by a whole lot. Now we can see, here's the picture. So now we're going to really tour around and see some pictures of what the square has looked like in the last, let's say, 25 to 30 years. These are 70s and 80s pictures, maybe later. This one is later. But again, what the French's store looks like now, and Lake Forest Food and Wine. Apartments were built above. The idea in the arts and crafts era was that the shopkeepers would be able to live above the stores, and this would be a much more humane thing than everybody having to commute to work. So people could live right there, and their work life could be integrated into their daily life and their family life, and people wouldn't be separated out from that. And so it was an idea that you would bring not only to wealthy people the benefits of the arts and crafts movement, but to all the different classes, including the merchant class. Now here's a nostalgia picture for you. Here's a close-up of the main building in the 80s. This is from publicity shots for Lake Forest College in our files there. But that sign, I believe, is now at the Historical Society, right, Shirley? It will be. It's not there yet? Okay. Keep your fingers crossed. Now here's a view of that same building, but from the vantage point of the fountain through the park as it looked basically from about 1940 until 2000. That 1940 plan had been done by Helen Brown Millman, a landscape architect married to the architect Ralph Millman, who did the post office. But you can see the building there at the end. This shows you the top of the building, the kind of escutcheon that was up there, sort of very formal thing. And again, this is vaguely Palladian in reference. Here's a different view. And here's a close-up of the escutcheon itself with Shaw's initials you'll see in there. It's a signed building. Here's the fountain. Notice there's no sculpture there, so this would be before the early 80s when that was put, when Sylvia Shaw Judson's sculpture went in there. And here it is with the sculpture there, put in the early 80s. Another view. And this is just from a different angle of it. Okay, so this would be I'm looking at the south side, I think. Okay, good. my angle here. Okay, now we're kind of touring around again, going back along the south side. And notice the rounded tower. Both towers in 1912 were going to be the same scale, but those little tower tops would have, that little helmet there, would have been down much closer to the second floor. It would have been just slightly raised. There we see it in more detail, and it's at least a story. I would say it's about a story higher than originally anticipated. And you can see the two-story character, the English, but really Northern European vernacular architecture from the Middle Ages on, and this is sort of like on the Romantic Road in Germany or in Alsace, you'd see some of this. But it was adopted by the English town planners at places like Hampstead Garden suburb outside of London, or now in London, and in Port Sunlight in Liverpool. Here we can see the sort of Queen Anne features of that over the south side. Fred Berghorn, where did you live? Somewhere around in here, right? Not too far?
The apartment just to the left of the screen.
Okay, all right. I got a few dark slides here, but showing the heating plant. Now, they made one major miscalculation, and Fred may have firsthand information about this. They put the furnace for the whole complex on the south. So all the time, the people who lived in the apartments from the teens until the 80s would be too hot on the south and too cold on the north. Why they didn't put the furnace on the north, I don't understand, because that, you know, they would have been, then the people on the north side were absorbing the wind more, and it would have been made more sense. So they goofed on that. They weren't perfect. This got converted later, these buildings, and then made a nice little alley out of that where we have an art gallery today and shops, and it's turned it. That was originally the truck alley, truck access to the backs of the merchants, though. The small trucks, when people had smaller trucks, it became obsolete. Now we're looking at, the other side of okay, now we're on the north side of the square. This was originally the post office, but when Ralph Millman built the post office in the early 30s, with the best money you could get, federal money, not investment money, that became commercial space. Looking further along that space, there you can see this, a sculpture by Sylvia Shaw Judson, also put in late in the 80s, and a little bit of the North Tower. There's the sculpture up above. There's the tower top. And this is really a focus of the community. Tom Rakovich can help me on this. This probably has influences from various things, but there's a certain Christopher Wren sort of character to this. There's also, I think, maybe a bow to a city hall in Scandinavia that came out around that time that was very simple, very plain on its lower parts of the tower. It also relates to Campanile in Italy and things, but it certainly is an attractive tower, had a very distinctive feature, instantly identifiable with Lake Forest. And one of the things we want to make sure is that this stays in the kind of character that it is today, or it has been. It's losing some of the tchotchkes up on top now, I think. There's another view of that side. And again, I think this little sequence is going forward in time. And one of these shots is Franz's. Franz may have taken this, Franz Schultz may have taken this view, or, yeah, I think he took that view just a few years ago. Okay, here we're going around the square, curling around here to where we have the Bouderie, and you can see, I believe that Jack Benny's folks lived upstairs in that apartment. Is that right, Shirley, at one point, or owned that?
They had a business, not in the square, but in the building.
Oh, just so this side, oh, okay,
Right.
all right.
That was Kowalski's building.
I'm close, but not close enough, okay. Tower again. I like these tower pictures. Okay, now here's how the square, the building went through some transitions. The Young Men's Club building was originally owned by the Young Men's Club, then taken over, I guess maybe when they became the Old Men, taken over by the city rec department when that was organized, and used in that capacity until the new rec build. No, and then they moved also over to the. I'm a little vague on the history of when that all happened, but certainly by 1984, it was becoming office and retail space also. Just to show the detail of the entry, I think this is on the north side. Wonderful entry with limestone surround there, or brick and limestone surround, very well detailed. There it shows its relationship to the future Southgate restaurant building. Then it was also, I think, the rec building, rec department. That's a dark picture, I have no idea. Oh, that might be, yes, Lake Forest Bank, which continued the same style. Okay, now what was interesting is that around 1980s, and around the time that the Lake Forest Improvement Trust was thinking about how they could cash out their investment, something very significant happened in the early 80s. And many of us will remember, some of us are way too young to remember, but others will remember that the PC hit. And it did something, it was the beginning of the decentralizing of business. And so people who'd had to be downtown all the time now could actually have offices in Lake Forest. And there was demand for office space. And those apartments, which had been too hot and too cold for the better part of 50 years or so, all of a sudden could be re-envisioned as office space. And so they were thinking of selling this to what eventually, now Broadacre Management was the first owner of it and is still the manager of it. And so Susan Dart, who was the spouse of one of the beneficiary owners, grandson of Howard Van Doren Shaw, she got interested in trying to preserve the buildings, interest people in getting them back into condition, and recognizing how important the square was. So this shows her crawling around up on the roof, pointing things out on the south tower, clock tower. I'm not sure where that. Okay, oh, there's the tower, but let's see. Oh, they're looking out from the clock and seeing the church that Shaw designed just across the street. He wanted to continue the same architecture on the other side on McKinley, but he only got the one building going, and he died in 1926. That building was completed in 1924. Too bad. Oh. Here again is that view from the tower looking toward the main building. Again. And here's looking down on the train station and the square as it looked in 1980 at the East End. Now, there were other things that were aspects of this. One of the things that Shirley figured out was that almost related to Market Square and just to the north of it, Shaw designed this more utilitarian building as a storage facility for rentals. Griffith had a huge rental business as people would go to Europe instead of keeping their house summers and Wednesday members, and they would rent their place out, and so they'd move their silver and their best furniture into his warehouse and maybe their clothes while they were off for a year. And then they would come back and get their tchotchkes out and go back and set up housekeeping. So this was a big, shifting things back and forth and storing them was a big business in Lake Forest. A very big business. Several people were involved in it. And the post office itself, 1931 approximately, 32, federal money, Hoover money I guess that would be, built that, and that's Ralph Millman, and it's in a very different style, but somehow it's blended in over the years so that we now consider it to be part of Market Square. And just a last reference here to John Griffith, who really was, I think, the person who, with lots of other people being involved in lots of capacities, people in Shaw's office, the contractor, James O. Hayworth, lots of people were involved, but I think it really was Griffith whose calculations, and he told them when they were ready to go that they had something that would actually rent to people and work in that space. And Market Square was to compete with people buying everything downtown in the big stores and bringing it out on the train. So it had to be very attractive. There was very little planted in the park initially until 1940 because the merchants wanted nothing between the people standing on the platform waiting for something good to happen after they got off the train and them being able to see each of those plate glass windows around there with the things that was supposed to attract them. So there were tulips, there were elm trees, and grass. That was basically what was there, and a flagpole way at the other end. The fountain was there, but not much of what we would consider to be garden. So 1940, we ticked up to a little bit more garden activity, and then in 1998 to 2000, with Market Square 2000 project and Rodney Robinson, much more garden feeling to the park. But that was a later addition and not part of the original idea. So that's just a kind of a quick view of some of these things, and I think we have a little time where I can maybe rustle some of us up here to the front if we turn the lights back up, and maybe Fred and Franz will come up and help answer questions that you might have a little bit about the architecture, its character, and what it was like to live early on in Market Square. At least Fred can do that part. And Fred actually has a model, not a model, but an artwork based on the measurements of Market Square, I think. Isn't that true, Fred?
A couple years ago at the Labor Day activity, there was a man who was demonstrating models that he made of homes. He came from Wichita, Kansas. In fact, he comes every year with some different subject. And so I had flirted with the idea of making a model of Market Square that I could just have in my house, because I felt very privileged to have been born and raised in Lake Forest, and I never left. And let me just tell you how that all happened. My mother and father in 1916 got married in Lake Forest, and they just happened to rent an apartment when Market Square opened for business and apartment rental. They rented an apartment in above Penny's Heaven, or a store that exists today, but just above there is the apartment they rented in 1916 when they got married. 3 years later, I was born in Ellis Home Hospital, and they brought me home from the hospital to that apartment, and I lived there for 14 years, and Market Square was my playground, and from day to day I would explore a different corner of the whole complex. The roof, the basement, the tower, you name it, I've been there. And I got stories to tell about all of that, but I'm not going to bother you with that, except to say the square was quite relatively simple in design when I was young. The center island didn't have a sidewalk, didn't have any flower beds. It just had the main features of the fountain and the flagpole. The rest of it was grass. And the grass was great for playing with other kids from the neighborhood who lived in other apartments. And we just felt that that was our playground. And I never thought too much of it until I'd gotten older and realized what a privilege it was to have grown up in that environment. So I've never left. And the other day I walked around there just to reflect on what it was when I was a kid. The automobiles used to park parallel to the sidewalk, not like they do today. And I thought about that for a while, and I realized that in those early days, in the 20s, there weren't too many automobiles. And as the pressure for more parking space came upon them, fortunately, in the design of the whole operation, the driveway around the island was wide enough that they could go to the type of parking they have today. So they got a lot more cars into Square than they originally visualized. And many of the pictures that I have seen just show automobiles parked parallel to the sidewalk. So over the years, I've seen many changes in the design of the island, the centerpiece, and they kept changing over the decades, and for good and for bad. For example, the fountain used to be deep, probably 3 feet deep, 2 feet deep, at least 3 feet deep. But then they realized that the kids might drown in there, so then along the way they filled it with concrete up to the level where there's very little water in there now. But that's one of the changes that I've seen along the way. I remember when the new post office was built, and they had a steam shovel that came in and dug the hole, and post office moved from where Helanders is over there and greatly expanded with a big building, and now we've outgrown the post office. Anyway, I used to play in the rec building behind Marshall Fields. There was a basketball floor on the second floor. And there was a pool table on the ground floor, so we'd go in there as kids and play pool or go upstairs and shoot baskets. And I remember every Friday night they had a portable movie projector they'd bring out, and they'd run movies with Tom Mix and all the cowboys. And anyway, and over where the Southgate is now was the police department and the fire department. And I used to spend a lot of time over there. I didn't have any brothers or sisters, so I needed some company, and they were willing to talk to me and teach me a lot of things. And I'd sit and watch the public go by, joining them. And so then I watched the movie theater being built. In fact, before it was built, there was a barn back there that belonged to the Anderson business, that it was on the corner. And we found in the barn a box of chocolate. And I never forgot the chocolate we enjoyed. They tore the barn down and they built the movie theater. And so I've seen a lot of changes in that whole area. So I'm open to questions if you have them.
And Franz, too, if he'd come forward a little bit. Reflect what I said.
You got better slides,
Yeah,
lighter ones.
later.
The mention was made of styles in Lake Forest, and it occurs to me that in the entire Market Square area there are no modernist buildings. And the styles of Market Square, as Arthur pointed out, do go back to a large extent to English antecedents, but also to Northern Europe, as I think he mentioned. He spoke, for example, of the half-timbered look, especially on the south elevation. And in the north tower, the one with the curves, that goes back in large part to Bavarian city hall architecture. So in that sense, it is an example of eclectic architecture in all respects. There's a step cable, as a matter of fact, I think on the north elevation as well. And as far as style is concerned, there is no better building in that whole area, in my estimation, than the post office. Mr. Millman's contribution, which is a perfect example not only of the style itself, but of the sort of thing that was being done under the aegis of the federal government at the turn of the 1930s. When you go in that building, for example, you'll find, as in the case of Art Deco, it's sort of a moment between the old-fashioned stuff, depending upon classical antecedents, and what eventually did become modernism. So when you are inside the post office, you can see, for example, pilasters, which are fluted the way old columns would be. There are wonderful chandeliers there. In my estimation, it's one of the best buildings in the city. As far as the remainder of the area is concerned that I remember from my own coming to Lake Forest, I do remember steam locomotives on the old Northwestern Railroad. I remember the North Shore, was it the North Shore Railroad? Yes. One of the great losses in my estimation to the entire area, which again, in the old days could take you not only down into the city, but all the way around the loop so that you could get off from the Art Institute only 1 block away. One of the great losses, I think, to the entire thing. Now, I think that's about it, Arthur. You did a very, very good job. And Jim and Shirley, incidentally, I want to say this. That is a great woman. And well, I've got to know Shirley through Arthur, and I know how much she has contributed to the knowledge that we have now of the whole city of Lake Forest. So, salute.
I was raised in Colorado, and I've been trying to think, who was the Illinois senator who joined with somebody in Indiana and put on a television show? Dirksen. Dirksen and who?
Charlie Halleck.
Dirksen and Halleck. Now, they had a television series that I think they talked weekly. Now, I think the television coverage that we get for these things is fantastic. I hear more people in Lake Forest say that they've seen somebody on the television or whatever it may be. But I think they could commercially have Sally or have Shirley and Art. We could have a show of Shirley and Art.
Dirksen came from Pekin, Illinois, not Colorado. So did you.
No. I heard the program when I was in Colorado. I knew that but I couldn't think of their names. Yeah, Edward Dirksen and Charlie somebody. But I think Shirley and Art would be a hit. No question. Thank you very much for coming.